Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the Gospel of Mark. This is session number 5. It's Mark chapter 7, verse 24 to 37. The title is Includes, and the lesson summary statement is Jesus extends mercy to all people. I've written on the board a statement and a question just to get the people moving in that direction as they come to the class. And then after we've had our announcements and attendance and prayer, then I'll ask them this question. Our world would be unrecognizable to the first century person. Can you give me some examples of that? And they'll give several examples. But one of the things that I'm trying to do is help them to see that our world is very different than the first century world when it comes to women's rights. About the closest we see to a parallel of first century is some of the conservative fundamentalist Islamic cultures and the way that women are so oppressed. Things like equality of the races. I mean, the Jews felt like that they were superior race. The Greeks felt like they were superior race. The Romans felt like there was none of this idea of the equality of races. Education. There was no public education. Only the wealthy were available to have education. Economics, there wasn't a capitalist system. There was mainly bartering and those kinds of things. Prison system. Even though we sometimes struggle with our prison system, there's a humanity to our prison system that certainly wasn't possible in the Roman prisons. And then benevolent ministries. Benevolent ministries are the result of the Christian faith, and hospitals came out of the Christian faith. And many of the scientific inventions are the result of a Christian worldview. And so if the first century person came back to our world, not only would these amazing inventions be a surprise to them, a miraculous thing to them, but these values would be completely foreign to them. You could make a case that this truth, Jesus extends mercy to all people, that's at the heart of these changes that have happened in our world since the first century, is because Jesus changed the way we think about people and the way we view people. And apart from Jesus' compassion, these two miracles that we're studying in chapter 7 simply would not have taken place. Jesus extends mercy to all people. Now, something of the context of what's going on. Mark has this hostility followed by popularity, followed by hostility rhythm that's going on in his gospel. In chapter 7, verse 1 to 23, it's that issue of hostility, and Jesus is facing the scribes and Pharisees, and they're dealing with the issue of uncleanness. The Pharisees, the scribes, confront Jesus about the fact that his disciples aren't washing their hands before they eat. And of course, it doesn't have an issue with hygiene. It is a matter of religious cleanliness. And Jesus confronts them with the Old Testament. This issue of uncleanness and the purity laws is what Mark's addressing in chapter 7. They will still be struggling with these issues of the purity laws when you get into the book of Acts. Peter has this vision in Acts chapter 10. It's clean and unclean animals. And you know the story. And what Peter comes to understand is God's not talking about eating clean or unclean animals. He's talking about unclean people, seeing people as unclean and unacceptable before God. That calls him on the carpet. And he knows that because he takes 4 witnesses with him. And they even have a debate about this in chapter 15 of the book of Acts, the Jerusalem Council, in which they're giving advice about how the Christians in Antioch, who are Gentiles, how they should respond. That was about 48 to 50 AD. And then in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul addresses the issue to the Corinthians, and that's the mid-50s. And so you see this reoccurring issue about this debate over foods. And it's a matter of this unclean issue. This was a very difficult issue for the Christians and the Jewish Christians, and particularly as they sought to reach Jews for Christ. And it's because it was such a part of their culture. It was such a part of their religion. They had built these laws around it. And so they were very difficult to give up. And you can see that some things that we believe that have a religious support to them or a cultural, long traditional support to them are extremely hard for us to give up. One is slavery. Our nation suffered immensely, enormously to deal with this issue of slavery. And still, 100 years later, we're struggling with the issue of racism as we had the civil rights movement. And then think about creation. For 2,000 years, people believed that if you ask them what's the explanation for the existence of this world, they would say creation. And that has been flipped now to where people say it's evolution. And to bring up the belief that you believe God created the world is anathema in many places. They think you're crazy about that. And think how difficult it'll be to switch that back to people believing this world came into existence by creation. And then there's all kinds of things, all the sexual issues that we're dealing with. My point I'm making is when you come to this issue, it may seem like it's kind of a non-starter or unimportant, but it was a deep issue that Jesus had to deal with. And part of what Mark's doing, remember his audience is Gentiles, probably a Roman audience, and these Christians, Gentiles, and these Christian Jews are having discussions about these matters, as well as seeking to reach Jews for faith in Christ. And what they need is an authoritative word from Jesus about this issue of clean and unclean. And Mark deals with that with an incident that happened in Mark chapter 7. Now, Jesus has moved out of the territory of the Jews, and he's moved into Gentile territory. We'll see that in just a moment. And so it's not just a matter of unclean foods. That's verses 1 to 23 in chapter 7. But in chapter 7, verse 24 to the end of the chapter, we're talking about unclean people. And this lesson is saying that Jesus extends mercy to all people, even unclean people. So we come to the first point in our lesson, and it is the matter of dejected. Dejected, chapter 7, verse 24 to 30. Jesus got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. That's about 35 miles to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. He entered a house, a Jewish house no doubt, and did not want to know it, and did not want anyone to know it. Well, it doesn't work because the next word says but. So he gets the opposite of what he wants. He wants some alone time, he wants to rest possibly, but just the opposite happens. But he could not escape notice. Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit. Now remember what the topic was in the first part of chapter 7, unclean. And Mark refers to this demon as an unclean spirit came, and this woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. Now notice verse 26, this long description that's given of this woman. The woman was a Gentile. Not just any Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. She was from Tyre and Sidon area. She was Phoenician. She was from the same group of people as Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, who brought in Baal worship and infiltrated all of Israel, the northern kingdom, with it. I mean, these were people far away from God. She was a Syrophoenician by birth. She was a Gentile woman. That's the main identification of this person. And she was asking him, and it's written in a tense that meant she kept on asking him. She kept after this. She continually asked him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, what I might do is stop, and without going into the explanation that I gave you about verse 26, I might just say, how is this woman described? And list those on the board, because it's kind of stacking up the issues. This person, if there was anyone who ever fit the idea of an unclean person, it was this person. In Matthew's telling of this story, Matthew records that the disciples said, "Send her away." That was their way of viewing this woman. This is no one, Jesus, that you need to be dealing with. And and then notice that she's not only a woman, and a Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile woman at that, but notice who she's coming to ask for. She's coming to ask for a daughter, not a son. Sons were more valuable than daughters in that day. And notice that Mark made it clear that she was possessed of a demon, but he called it an unclean spirit. So if there was anyone Jesus didn't need to have anything to do with, it was this woman. But we've come to learn that you might as well expect the unexpected from Jesus. So the disciples, according to Matthew, says, "Jesus, send her away." And so what does he do? Verse 27, he said to her, he engaged her in conversation. But listen to what he says. This would be something to discuss with the class. What does he mean? Let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, that doesn't sound like Jesus, does it? And so I would ask the class, what does Jesus mean? What did your personal study guide, your studies this week, reveal about what this statement was? And that'll give you a chance to talk about that as well. Now, notice that the written word doesn't let us know the tone in which Jesus said it, and it doesn't give us the facial expression on Jesus' face. We don't know if he said this. We don't know if he said this softly. We don't know if he said it with a little edge to his voice. We don't know if he said it dismissively. We just don't know. But this is what he said. And so what is it that Jesus is driving at? And she says to him in verse 28, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now, I'll let you deal with the study in your book about the dogs and the various understandings of that. But what she basically gets is I understand why you're here. I know who you are. You're the Messiah that Israel has been expecting. And I know why you're here. You're here to bring the message of salvation to the Jews. I understand that. So sure, yes, children are fed before the dogs are fed. But the dogs are fed. And in essence, what she's saying is, Jesus, you have healed other Jewish little girls. And you have enough that you could heal a Gentile little girl. And Jesus, you have caused demons to leave Hebrew people, Jewish people. And you have enough, Jesus, that you could also see that demons leave Gentile people. And so, Lord, yes, of course, the children need to be fed. But there's enough left over for the dogs to eat. Have you ever known a messy eater? I have a story I'm going to tell about a kid that used to come to our, when he was small, we had a meal, and it just destroyed the carpet around it. And for whatever reasons, he took a liking to me, and he sat next to me. And I would get up, and it looked like there was more food on the floor than there was that they had fed him. But this is the picture that he's using at this time. And then notice verse 29. Then he told her, "Because of this reply, you may go." Now Matthew says that Jesus, in addition, said, "Great is your faith." In other words, that's the worship, that's the obedience that I'm looking for. Because of this reply, because you know who I am. She called him Lord. It's the only person in Mark's gospel that calls Jesus Lord. She falls at his feet. There was a Jewish synagogue leader named Jairus in chapter 5 that fell at Jesus' feet. And if you put those two together, it's a way of saying that all people should fall at the feet of Jesus in worship and recognition. But because of this reply, because you know who I am and because you know what I came to do, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. You'll notice in verse 30, it just simply says, when she went back to her home. There's no doubt, there's no argument, there's no asking of proof. She takes Jesus at his word. And that's one of the descriptions of faith in the Bible. We've talked about this again before. In the Bible, biblical faith involves knowledge. You have to know some stuff about Jesus. It involves assent or agreement. You believe these things are true, but if you stop there, you haven't got biblical faith, because there are people who know these things, who believe that it's true, he died on the cross and rose from the dead, but they haven't acted upon it. Their life has not had impact by it. This woman acts upon the truth that Jesus gave her. She had real biblical faith. And when she gets home, notice that the observable symptom that the demon has left her is that the child is found lying on the bed. Isn't there's just hardly anything more beautiful than a child sleeping. I remember our children when they were babies looking at them and thinking, this is what cherubim must look like in heaven. They just rest so peacefully and so relaxed. And there must have been something of that. And when she saw the baby, this little daughter, lying in bed, she knew the demon was gone. So we've gone through the text. We've had a chance to talk about it. And I'm going to ask the class, have you ever experienced prejudice? Or have you ever been made to feel you're an outsider? I have a couple of stories to tell them. One is about me. When I was a boy and I worked in the fields with my grandfather and my uncles, and we came to a restaurant in town, and I didn't realize what was going, but they didn't serve us. And the reason, I found out later, is they didn't want to serve field hands like that in their restaurant. So consequently, the waitress brought us a glass of water, never brought us a menu. And my grandfather understood that in time, and we got up and left and went and bought some bologna and bread and cheese, and that was our lunch that day. That was my first experience of prejudice. I have a lady in our church who's an African American. She grew up in Florida. She's my age. Her family was the first black family that bought a home in an all-white neighborhood. And she tells about coming home from church or coming home from an event, and all of her family's in the car, and the white people would stand out in the yard and scream at them and yell at them and tell them that they were not wanted there. I mean, I can't imagine that. That's in our lifetime when that happened. So I'm just curious if someone in the class has ever experienced prejudice or ever been made to feel an outsider. And then share some of those stories, because this is what this woman is. There's a scene in the movie 42. The movie's about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier to be the first black professional baseball player. Very, very powerful, very moving movie. Ricky Branch, the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and Jackie Robinson were both Christians. They don't play that up as much as they should, but it was what motivated both of those men in order to do what they did. But Pee Wee Reese was the shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and there's a scene in the movie. It's a famous story told about baseball, and they are playing in Cincinnati. Many of his friends and family from Kentucky are in the stands to see him, and he walks over to Jackie Robinson. He puts his arm around him, puts his arm over his shoulder, and they're looking up into the stands, and he tells Jackie Robinson, he said, my people are up there. And he said, they need to know. They need to know where I stand. It was a very wonderful, powerful picture of acceptance. The point is dejected. And before I turn loose of the point, I want to ask the class, who are the people that we know who feel low in spirit, who feel downcast and gloomy? Who are people that are like that? And one of them that I want to give them as an example are our youth. Some of the stories about the research about our youth is very troubling. 30% of our youth feel anxious or greatly anxious every day or most every day. 30% of these young people. The number of youth who have said that they have had a major depressive moment in their life in 2007 was 8%. In 2017, it's 17%. And I can't imagine what it has become since COVID. So is there something our class could do to be a source of encouragement, to express the mercy and love of Jesus to our youth? That might be worth talking about in that class. Just maybe a card to some of these kids saying, John, I'm praying for you. I hope you have a good school year. Or just walking up to them, put your arm around them like a Pee Wee Reese and just giving them an encouraging word, a positive comment about their life. Might just be what it is. Another group that has this feeling of a low spirit, a gloomy spirit, are jobless people. And I've had the experience of being pastor of people who've experienced joblessness over these several years. And it's not just the man or the woman who loses the job that's troubled, it affects the whole family. Children have enough sense to know that if dad's not working, how are we going to have money to have enough to buy food for? And so sometimes it may be somebody jobless in the church, and maybe there's something we can do that would extend God's mercy. So I'm just saying, Jesus reached out to the dejected and he expressed mercy, and that's his calling for us as well. The second point is the deaf. Mark chapter 7, verse 31 to 35. Verse 31 starts with the word again. And this connects these events to being in Gentile territory. Again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. Now, nobody goes that way. Tyre, I mentioned, is 35 miles northwest of the Sea of Galilee. Sidon is about 20 miles further up the coast. So he goes from the region of Tyre into the region of Sidon. He goes north, and then he loops back down by the Sea of Galilee. If you may want to have your folks turn to a map in the back of their Bible, a map that has the life and times of Jesus, and it'll have, many of them will have these areas marked off, and you'll see this kind of looping travel that Jesus took. It's estimated that he traveled 120 miles, and he did this on foot, of course. And why would he do that? Well, some have said he wants to be alone, and he's with his disciples, he's looking for rest, but also it takes him out of the area of Herod Antipas, who we had learned earlier had killed John the Baptist and is hostile towards Jesus. So, verse 31, again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee through the region of the Decapolis. Decapolis is in the southeast part near the Sea of Galilee. They brought him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus. It means they implored him. There was an intensity about it. They begged Jesus to lay his hand on him because that's the way they understood healing to take place, laying your hand on someone. So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak clearly. Have you ever spent time or been around or worked with people who were deaf? And if so, how did you communicate with them if you don't know sign language? That would be an interesting conversation to have with your class. And then after that, what I'm wanting to point out in this passage is how Jesus communicated with this deaf man. Now imagine this deaf man's in front of Jesus. It's just this man and Jesus. Jesus is not doing a carnival miracle show. He pulls this man aside, just this man, and he sticks his fingers in the man's ears. And the man must have understood Jesus knew that he was deaf. And then apparently Jesus spit in his hand, and he took the saliva, because he didn't spit on the man's face. The man's tongue wasn't hanging out. He must have spit in his hand, taken his finger and mixed it in with that saliva, because in that day they thought spittle had healing powers. And he must have touched that man's tongue, basically saying, my tongue's free, I'm going to set your tongue free. And then it says that Jesus looked up to heaven. And so, you're thinking of this deaf man. This man recognized Jesus looking up to heaven. He's looking to where the source of help is going to come. It's going to come from God. This is going to be divine power. And then it says of Jesus that he groaned. It's a word that's powerful with empathy. And so this man knows Jesus, feels the hurt, the difficulty of what it must be like to be mute and deaf. Imagine the isolation of this man. And then Jesus pronounces, be opened. And immediately the man heard, and the man spoke clearly. Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's communicating to a man who can't hear and can't speak. He's communicating to him in a way, I'm going to heal you, your ears are going to be opened, and your tongue is going to be set free. And that's exactly what happened. I have a simple assignment for people in this lesson. And I'm going to, as soon as I mention it to them, I tell them, you're going to know this is an act of extending mercy. And this is what the assignment is this week. I want them to make a greater effort at speaking to people and greeting them. Now, we may think that's a little thing, but I can easily illustrate how the difference. Have you ever gone through a drive-through to get your food, and when they handed the food to you, they handed it out the window and they turned their face the other way? Wouldn't you like to just call out to them and say, hey, look at me? And then you go to another drive-through, fast food, and the people greet you and they're friendly. They even ask your name and they talk to you and ask your day. It's an altogether different kind of experience. Now, this is what I'm saying. Just going through a day, just pick a day. Don't try and do it for a whole week, but just pick a day, say Tuesday. And that day, as often as you can, you're going to look at someone and you're going to smile at them and you're going to greet them with hello or good day. And just watch what happens to people. How they'll respond, how it lifts their spirit, how their face will express some kind of happiness and joy. And you'll be amazed at what it does for you as well. It's a simple way in which to express mercy, kindness, love towards people. Now, last of all, I want you to see the dumbfounded. In verse 36 and 37, he ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. They just couldn't keep themselves quiet. They were extremely astonished and said, he has done everything well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Verse 37, it's almost like every word is in bold letters. It is emphasized. And what they're gushing over is his actions in verse 36, and they're gushing over his character in verse 37. Why did Mark include this miracle? We know that the miracles are included to teach us that Jesus is the Son of God and that he has come to be our Savior. But how many times do you have to say that? Every miracle that Mark includes in his gospel, he's giving us another insight into Jesus. He forgives the sin of the man that's lowered through the roof to convey that he has the authority and the power to forgive sins. There's the man in the synagogue with the withered hand. And Mark teaches us that Jesus has the authority. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. There's Jairus' daughter in chapter 5 who has died. And Jesus has the authority, the power to raise her from the dead. But why? Why this story of a man who's blind and mute, and then to tell us that he says to them, don't tell anybody, and they can't help it, they tell everybody. What's the point of that? Well, first of all, would you not agree if Jesus says you should do something or you should not do something, then you should do it or you should not do it. So these people are obviously in disobedience to Jesus. Now we can understand why they're so excited about it, but they're disobeying Jesus. And the commentary goes into the messianic secret, and you can talk about that. But what Mark is doing is preparing us for Isaiah 35. In Isaiah 35, it says that one of the signs of the messianic age is the Messiah is going to cause the mute to speak and the deaf to hear. And so here the Messiah has arrived. Now, Isaiah also goes on to say that when the Messiah arrives, there's two kinds of responses. One is you need to repent of your sin and make yourself right with the Lord. And then you need to also know that He has promised to rescue us from our enemies. So this is a day to get ready. And Mark is saying that day has arrived. When the Messianic age comes, people will hear the Messiah and they will obey the Messiah. Well, the Messiah has arrived, and what's going to happen in the coming chapters is He's going to begin to clearly tell them about His means of salvation. In chapter 8, He's going to tell them plain and simple that He's going to die by crucifixion. And what does Peter do? First of all, Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ. And then He begins to tell them about the cross, and Peter rejects that. And he's not hearing, he's not obeying. And you see this continuing story of the fact that people hear, but they don't obey. And one of the things that's happening is they're coming to understand the true Messiah, and the Messiah that we're to obey. We are to do what He wants instead of what we want. Now, the way I'm going to close the lesson is in our hymnal in our church on page 421, there's this song, Whosoever Meaneth Me. And I just want to tell them the history of that song, about how it came to be written by an 18-year-old and became a popular evangelistic revivalist kind of song. And then I just want to walk through it. I found a good explanation of the verses. The first verse talks about joy. The second verse talks about hope. The third verse talks about love. And the chorus is this repeating refrain, whosoever surely meaneth me. And it's almost like the hymn writer is saying, I can't believe that this salvation is available to me. And the Syrophoenician woman would understand that. The deaf man would understand that. But sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten the awe of the fact that it means me too. And so I just want to go through this hymn, and I have a couple of people who can lead, and we may sing the hymn as well as we close out the lesson. Jesus Christ expresses mercy, gives mercy to all people. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's Word.